Hello everybody and welcome to our 13th and final video on the Middle Ages. Today we're going to be looking at crime and punishment in the Middle Ages. So, as always, we begin with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this presentation, you guys should know who was in charge of law on the manor and who was in charge in the town. You should know 3 forms of non-lethal punishments, and you guys should know two types of medieval executions or capital punishment, and what the purpose of these executions were. So I think it is appropriate that the 13th video in our series of videos is on the gruesome, sadistic, and sometimes downright strange practices of crime and punishment in the Middle Ages. We're going to be drawing on elements of all our knowledge so far to get a view of what it was like at the time. So first of all, it is important to point out that there was no police in the Middle Ages. The first professional police force in Ireland was set up in the 1810s, and in Britain in the 1820s, and they had the nickname of the Peelers. Now remember from our study of the Lord that the Lord acted as a judge in the local village or on the manor, with court taking place in the Great Hall. Remember, bailiffs were sent to arrest those who were accused of crime and brought them to the Lord, who acted as the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Many of the people who had been found guilty were put in these dungeons in the lower basements of the house of the castle. They were not like modern prisoners who would have some rights. They were pretty much just thrown in prison and left there. However, in the towns, there were different punishments other than imprisonment that could be handed out. The people in charge of punishment in the town were the town government or the town council, which is a collection of men, usually from the upper class. One of the rules that could be broken, people get in trouble for it, would be breaking of curfew. So this was the time that all fires had to be out by. A watchman was sent to patrol the streets at night. Not that kind of watchman. He looked a little bit more like this. Another crime that was common was theft. So theft was taken very seriously in the towns, and a thief could have their hand cut off or they could be executed. If you committed a lesser crime, public humiliation was usually the order of the day. The vices, such as these, the stocks, which were planks of wood with holes cut in them for people's feet and hands, and pillories, which had holes cut for the head and hands while the person stood, were used where people when people were in this, they would be attacked with verbal abuse, rotten food, and even stones would be thrown at them as well. So like if you were a butcher or a carpenter or a baker and were found to be deliberately selling bad products, you can end up in the stock or the pillory. Or you could be dragged along on through the streets on a huddle, which was this wooden sleigh, and they'd have to hold their bad product or their bad produce and face the public humiliation. There was also specific punishments if you were caught gossiping. This was seen as a sin, and they would sometimes be put in a thing called a ducking stool, like this, where they would be repeatedly lowered into the local river or pond, simulating drowning, which would be quite a frightening thing. They would also be forced to wear this device called a skull bridle to prevent them from talking. Again, a very difficult. Some of these punishments might look somewhat humorous to us today. They could be, in fact, very brutal and I'm sure quite traumatic on people, as were the executions of the time. Now, we call executions capital punishment. So capital punishment is the legally authorized killing of someone as a punishment for a crime. We've already encountered examples of this, of people being burned at the stake, such as women being accused of using witchcraft, or Jews who had been accused of spreading the Black Death by poisoning wells. But the most common form of execution was hanging. And these hangings took place in public to act as shock to other people. The criminal would first be condemned at court, and then there was the death procession, which was the walk that they would go on to the place of execution, and then the execution itself. Now, the second reason these things were done in public, other than to shock people into following the laws, was to show the authority of God and those who are in charge of the people, i.e., the Lord or the government, the town council, or the town government, or the king. Another popular form of execution at the time was public beheading, carried out by an executioner. And just as we talked about how a craftsman would go through his stages of being, a apprentice, a journeyman, and a master craftsman, so too with executioners. They would be journeymen, and their reputations could be destroyed if they botched up an execution. Um, these executions became like public forms of entertainment, as so often happens when people are faced with their mortality and their powerlessness. They attempt to gain some sort of control over the brutality by turning the solemn, terrifying act into something else that they feel they have control of. There was also in the Middle Ages the beginning of the phenomenon known as the highwaymen. Though the most famous highwaymen would operate after the Middle Ages, stories of people like Robin Hood were based on real people who were bandits that would rob people as they travelled from town to town. So whether Robin Hood was real is debated to this day. There are lots of different theories that we're not going to get into. But that men like him existed is not in doubt. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, the end of our study of the Middle Ages. So by now you guys should know who was in charge of law in the manor and who was in charge in the town. You guys should know 3 forms of non-lethal punishments and what they were used to punish, what crime they were used to punish. And you guys should know 2 types of medieval executions or capital punishment and what the purpose of the executions were, those 2 things we talked about. So thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.